This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
I'm very pleased to welcome John Hinshelwood. John did an MA at the Centre of Metropolitan History, right?
Yes.
A little while ago now.
Yes.
I'm not going to ask how long. Actually, it's probably more recently than my MA, so if that makes you feel any better. And is studying these days is working on parts of North London where he actually lives, I believe.
That's right. Yeah.
And particularly post-war council housing. Not a particularly sexy topic necessarily. Not necessarily, but
Who's this person?
I'm a medievalist. So I don't really know what I speak. But let's see. John, hopefully, John has, as you said, copies of the Hornsey Historical Society publication, which has the article based on which this talk is based on, available for sale if anyone's got any change. I've looked, I haven't. But we can probably come to an arrangement of that at some point if it needs to be. At this juncture, I have nothing more to say than to thank John for coming and thank you all for coming on this rather sort of bleak autumnal evening. And without more ado, I'm going to turn the lights off and let him get on.
Thank you very much. Well, and thank you all for coming. Yes, as Adam said, I did a MA some years ago, but before that, before I did the MA, I'd had a fairly long-standing interest in the development of council housing, and Hornsey, which you can see here, this part, Hornsey, is one of three boroughs that in 1965 went to make up the London Borough of Haringey, which I highlighted on this map, and I don't know if you can see it because it's so faint here, but it's to the north of London, and it used to be in outer London before the GLC was formed and formed all the Greater London boroughs. So it's the western portion of Haringey, which has various reputations. You may have heard of them. But Hornsey has a long tradition of council housing. And I've been studying that, looking at it, over a number of years. And I want to give you some background to that. And this talk really arose out of a number of things. First of all, it's more of a survey and a review and bringing together all of the work I'd previously done on council housing, which goes back to 1897. I brought it up to date by looking at the actual provision of housing after the Second World War, and that just happened to coincide with the summer school that I came to this year, which looked at 20th or late 20th century and late 20th century local history, and it seemed to me it would be a good thing to come back and do some more about. So really, as it is at the moment, it's more of a survey of the work that I've done. I wouldn't claim it to be a complete history. I'm sure you'll all have lots of questions which I can't answer. But it's mostly about the buildings, and it's mostly about the physical development. But what I want to show you is the range of council housing, talk about the people who were involved in developing it and the influences that they were under, and also to talk about the policy that the Hornsey Council had in terms of social housing and rentals. So that's what I'm going to do. So to begin with, I just want to recap. Hornsey started its council housing it opened its first council housing in 1897. And before the First World War, it opened in effect, two estates, one in Hornsey Village and one in Highgate Village, and they did that in a number of phases. After the First World War, they were somewhat slow in picking up the housing programme, to a certain extent because many people on the borough council were builders and thought building ought to be something that was left to them rather than the council, and that enough houses for the working classes had been built in a borough which actually aspired to be a middle class borough, and wanted that to be its reputation. Anyway, under pressure from the Ministry of Health and the trade unions and local population, they started building again in 1932, and they built right up until the eve of the Second World War. And they all of those council housings I've researched and written up in previous bulletins. So we're picking this up in 1938, really, because they were the precursors of what was going to happen after the Second World War. By 1964, I missed the slide, did I? By 1964, there were over 2,000 council dwellings in the borough. A significant proportion of the population of Hornsey, something just under 10%, was housed by the council. And those council housings concentrated in two areas. The largest being in Stroud Green, which is just beside Finsbury Park, those that know North London, and the other large concentration had developed around the early council housing in Hornsey Village. In all, after the Second World War, they built 19 schemes of housing, 27 blocks of flats and 15 houses. I say that slightly advisedly because if you plough through all the minutes and whatever, keeping track of all these different schemes is very, very difficult. But luckily, in 1964, the Treasurer published in his annual accounts a summary of all council housing going back to 1897, which gives a very nice overview, and I've used that a lot for this. Wait while people settle down.
Let you get some chairs out for yourself. It's the stuff.
That's not the door.
This one here.
There's one to mark on and then
And another.
People flocking in.
Absolutely fine as long as you haven't come for a Spanish class. I think that happened to me. I've been teaching history. People say, oh, I'm here for Spanish. Sorry.
Okay. Right, sorry, John.
That's all right. Well, for those that just come in, I've just done a very quick sort of background to what we're talking about. After the Second World War, the Hornsey Council built just over fairly well over 1,000 new dwelling schemes. If you look at the 1964 Treasurer's accounts, of course, it only records slightly fewer, because some of those properties were sold off under a fairly permissive sale of council dwellings, which I'll come to later. But these just over 1,000 new developments really took place, and I've summarised here the sort of phases that they occurred in. The largest two developments here at the top were between 1947 and 1964, because that's when Hornsey disappeared. The little plus there means that they carried on when it became Haringey. Haringey continued developing in the Hornsey Village, continued developing it everywhere. Then the next concentrations were in Crouch End and around Highgate, and then there were a few scattered developments in the rest of the borough. What I'm really going to work up to is the two big estates in Stroud Green, as it's called, the Stroud Green estate, and in Hornsey, what came to be known as the Campsbourne cottage estate, or Campsbourne estate. And these two estates, which really were the extreme concentrations, just summarising that they both included just over 200 dwellings. And I use dwellings because we're talking about dwellings, we're not talking about buildings, we're talking about, in effect, flats and houses and flatted houses, and the only way you can make a meaningful comparison is by actually concentrating on the dwellings. How many people were in the dwellings is a different matter. Okay, so we get this idea that we've got these two main areas of council housing developed by 1964, but not exclusively in those two areas. The precursors to this post-war housing can be found in 1938, just before the war. At that stage, Hornsey had got to the point of deciding that even though it wanted to declare itself a nice, good, middle-class borough, very pleasant place to live, it did have slums. And it had some very severe slums. It had a number of areas of slums. And the Campsbourne estate, which is a little map here, it's just this little line of roads here, which was built in 1866 in the grounds of a large house called the Campsbourne House, was the worst area in the borough for deprived housing conditions. The medical officer's health report constantly went back to the state of things. There was a social survey of Hornsey done in the 1920s, which also had identified Campsbourne as being the worst area of deprivation in this nice middle-class borough, which promoted itself as healthy Hornsey, the place to come and live. The other precursor was a new form of council housing which was developed shortly before the Second World War, and here it is. It's this small, low-rise blocks of flats called Kellan Close in Crouch End, which was heralded by various local people as a novel and new form of council housing. And that was the work of this man, Melville Richards, who had worked for Hornsey since 1926, and he became the engineer and surveyor to the borough in 1938. So one of his first things was to tackle things like Kellan Close and to tackle the issue of Campsbourne. Campsbourne was declared a slum area, and the council obtained a clearance just before the outbreak of war. In the outbreak of war, everything stopped. But Melville Richards, who was effectively Hornsey's first proper town planner, decided also that he was going to look at the provision of council housing, and he brought up these new designs for Kelland's Close. He was to go on during the Second World War to work with a number of architects to develop his ideas about council housing, so that after the Second World War he was able to start producing some very well regarded and novel schemes. The problem that Hornsey faced was that during the Second World War it suffered an enormous amount of bomb damage, war damage. And reading the Borough Treasurer's reports in 1948, he reported, this is to the council, that no other borough treasurer in the county had the temerity to assume the responsibility for carrying out such a task, and he'd been assured that Hornsey was well to the fore in the performance of these emergency tasks. And the emergency, or the task that he was faced with, was absolutely enormous, because the estimate was that there was only something like 10% of the housing stock in the borough that had not been damaged by aerial bombardments. And it had all been knocked down, but housing had to be treated as a major priority. And here you've got a picture of some of the most spectacular bomb damage in the Haringey area, it was a major problem. I mean, they had to install a whole range of temporary prefabricated units, and they had an awful job in terms of rehousing people who were bombed out. So after the war, the council decided it couldn't return to its slum clearance programme in the Campsbourne estate. First thing it had to do was to deal with post-war reconstruction. And so we get, effectively, the Stroud Green estate flats that we talked about as a post-war reconstruction. The Campsbourne estate, which mentioned, which was slum clearance, came somewhat later, after they felt they got on top of the war damage. So the first flats at Stroud Green were opened in 1947, and these were in Stroud Green. These were war damaged. 2 blocks were opened, and these are the ones shown here. This is the wall call which fronts onto the Stroud Green Road, and this one is quite interesting because this is on the corner of 2 roads, and in effect you're looking at the back of the flats, because the entrance you had to go around the back, and that was round a little garden. So it's a much nicer aspect if you go in through the front door. When you walk along the road and look at it, you think that's a bit of a boring old flat. But these flats were reported on in an article in the Financial Times in 1948, and they commented very favourably on the features, which they said were designed to ensure comfortable and labour-saving flats. And this is the work that Melville Richards had been doing during the war with architects, which he found by going to the RIBA, Royal Institute of British Architects, and saying, look, we want to start building these flats, and we've got to build them on a bit of a mass production basis, so I'd like some help. And he got these architects to come in. What this means in terms of looking at the flats is we're not really quite sure in a lot of cases who the architects were, but certainly it was all the work, the basic work was laid out by the borough engineer with architectural support. Some of the architects are known, Hornsey didn't have a direct works. A few of the contractors are known, but that is work that really needs to be looked at in a lot more detail to try and actually draw that out. So in Campsbourne, the first flats were some 7 or 8 years later, in the 50s. And at first sight, they are of a different appearance. I'm going to say a different style. They look somewhat different. When I first looked at the Campsbourne estate, I thought, this whole estate is really quite remarkable, much better than the Stroud Green estate. But actually, when you look into it, they're very comparable. So what I want to do is just to go through some of the aspects that make me realise that the flats were quite significant, quite difficult. Hornsey was quite rightly a number of people in Hornsey were quite rightly very proud of their record in terms of providing housing for the working classes, proud of their designs. The early estates were well reported by people like Tarn and Corn, and they were held up as great models. After the Second World War, the council was sufficiently proud of what it was doing that it decided to enter some of these flats as architectural models. First of all, for competitions in the Festival of Britain, which were these. Hornsey obviously thought these were, the sort of things that ought to compare well with something like the Lansbury estate. I personally think they do compare very well. And then 2 years later, they entered more flats for schemes of the Ministry of Housing and Local Government competitions. Now, I can't tell you whether they won or not, but I'm assuming they didn't win because it's not been reported in blazoned headlines in a local paper, and neither is it recorded in the minutes what the outcome of those. Although the minutes do record that they made these submissions. So we've got a list of flats. Now, these don't all correspond to the two estates, but these two flats in Stroud Green, and these two blocks of flats in Stroud Green there, and 2 blocks of flats in Stroud Green in both competitions. These other flats were scattered elsewhere around the borough. I want to quickly just go through and show you those and make 1 or 2 comments. The Connaught Road Carlton Lodge flats in Stroud Green were somewhat similar to the Walcourt flats. Carlton Lodge, this one, is really notable. It was the second largest single scheme that the council developed, and it had. I just have to. Second largest flats are 6 4-bedroom, 46 2-bedroom, and 2 1-bedroom flats. So they were building for a range of occupants, but predominantly for 2-bedroom accommodation. The other 2 flats in Stroud Green, which went into the Ministry of Housing and Local Government competition, Fernfields, which I think is perhaps one of the most attractive street aspects of all of the flats that they built, and it stands at the top of a hill with fine views out over London, and if I had to move into a flat, I think I'd probably go for one of those. But It's a 3-storey block of 9 flats, and it takes its name from one of the ancient manors of Hornsey. The other block of flats, which is this one, which is not that far away, it has a much more utilitarian look about it. Built in the same time, 1952, that doesn't do anything for me, to be quite honest. But I mean, it shows that there was a degree of experimentation going on in terms of the actual style of the buildings. Unfortunately, I don't know the architects of either of those, so I can't really say very much more about it, other than that they're of a very different style. So if we just move away from those flats, other flats that went into these competitions, the building research flat competition, Mildura Court in Hornsey is a very large, flat-fronted but quite attractive block of flats. And one of the things about it is it's well supported by open space round about. I mean, that tends to get encroached on now. But they did have the idea that although they were flats, there should be open space, landscaped open space and gardens around the flats. I'll just go... I don't know what's happened there. There's obviously some corruption on my USB, I think. This is, unfortunately, you can't see it, but it's a small group of 3 two-storey blocks of flats built round an open garden with a nice planting in it, and it's actually in amongst a Victorian residential street. And if you just walked along the street, you could be quite easily forgiven for not really noticing it was there, because it blends in so well with the front gardens and the character of the street. So it's a very sympathetic development. Sorry about that. I hope there aren't any more like it. The largest block of flats up in Highgate, Hillcrest, just opposite its very famous nearly namesake, High Point, which was this wonderful modern development by Gestetners for their workers. This, on the other side of Highgate North Hill, is a very pleasant estate of 7 tower blocks, which in a landscaped garden, which we do know the architect of that, a man called T.P. Bennett. This was one of the things that were most praised by the Financial Times. And the these flats provide, is on a 5.5 acre site, providing accommodation with a density of 75 people per acre, which is considerably less than the maximum that was recommended by the County of London building plan. It's still there, and it's still a nice landscape body. Unfortunately, Haringey Council think there's enough room to start building other flats and, on that same estate, but I'm not sure what's going to happen. But it wasn't all flats. They built two estates for old people in Muswell Hill, and this is one of them, Keen's Close in Muswell Hill. Bungalows around a landscaped cul-de-sac built in 1947, and there was another small little development not that far away, off-road, only accessible by a footpath. But it shows that they weren't just building for standard tenants. They had a mind that there were old people, and they also had in mind that there were the need to make special provision for people with other special needs. And in Muswell Hill, they also built a extension for a road called Springfield Avenue, which was a private development originally, again in terms of model of architectural development, where, and I can't remember the dates, but each house was architect designed, each house was quite specifically a single model development. And that's how Springfield Avenue came into being. And in 1950, the council turned the corner and developed it by building a series of council houses, which you can see in these 4 pictures. And it's on quite a steep hill, so it's quite well landscaped, and the houses now, in many cases, really, as you can see here, quite overwhelmed by the slope and the growth on the slope, so that these must actually now be quite dim. Light access to those flats, those rooms is poor. On the other side of the road, where it's up the hill, of course, you get a much more open aspect. And I think this is lastly what I think is one of the finest surviving flats in Crouch End, Ramsey Court, 1951, by an architect called Mr. Bancroft, who I believe was local authority architect. He certainly went on to be an architect working for the London Borough of Barnet. Whether he was working for Haringey at the time he designed these, I don't know. But I think this is one of the most attractive flats. But it's of a very different style from the early ones which went into that we've looked at in terms of Otway Court and Norman Court. And okay, so that's a very quick survey to give you an idea of the general development of council housing. So we'll return to the 2 estates. Stroud Green estate and Camsbourne estate, I've listed here all the different phases, all the different schemes. And you can see that in Stroud Green it started in 1947, and by 1960 it was completed. So that was all the wall construction. Camsbourne started in 1953, so by the time they got down to 1953 they thought that most of the war damage construction was underway and in hand, and they could turn their attention and go back to the idea of slum clearance in Camsbourne. They'd also got a lot of experience by then of clearance orders, because all the war damage reconstruction had to be done on the basis of compulsory purchase orders, inquiries, site clearances, rehousing whatever tenants were left, and then rebuilding. A long, drawn-out process, which must have been extremely difficult to manage. And as I say, if you go through the minutes, trying to keep track of what's happening on all these different schemes as they're developing, it is remarkable, because they didn't all just go through easily. There were all manner of hiccups and setbacks. So anyway, we come back to Stroud Green Estate, which opened in 1947, wall court, heralded by John Betjeman as one of the finest flats to be built in London after the war. The flats had a kitchen large enough to take a table and the necessary equipment, and that included things like refrigerators, which were just coming into popular. People were buying them, and it Kitchens were well ventilated with a canopy over the cooker, a solid fuel boiler to provide constant hot water, adequate cupboard space and room for a refrigerator. It included a living room with windows to a balcony, light and airy bedrooms with deep built-in wardrobes and a bathroom and water closet. Room for prams was provided and rubbish disposal was by means of a chute accessed from the balcony. So these were what Melville Richards had designed as high convenience flats. And although we hadn't got the plans for all of the flats, and that's an interesting question of why we haven't got plans for all of the flats, we can assume that most of the flats on the Stroud Green estate were built to that standard. I think the standards on Campsbourne, because it was starting a bit later and because the nature of that development was a lot more varied than in Stroud Green, we probably got better accommodation in a number of cases. The reason I say it's an interesting question about why we haven't got plans is because Hornsey Council, although its engineer had plans submitted for all developments, and those were recorded and went to planning committees, when they were doing it themselves, they obviously felt they didn't need to submit plans for what they were doing themselves, and so they aren't recorded. We don't, in all the plans that are there, we don't have plans for these flats, or if we do, they're buried away in the archives somewhere or is yet to be discovered. Some of the earlier council housing, they did have plans for those, and they were beautiful, and a lot of those disappeared, finding their way to Camden Market as very nice watercolours. But anyway, so it gives an indication of the standard of accommodation that was being provided by the council. So they went on apace to build a whole range of flats, which had, many of them had this common feature of these balconies. This one from the street, again, is a lot more utilitarian looking, just sort of flat fronted. But if you start poking around and going down the sides of these flats, you find that some of this one in particular, between the flats on one road and the flats on another road, there is a large open landscaped park with the entrances leading from that park into the flat. So you don't have direct access from the street, whereas in these ones the direct access is from the street. So they didn't have the same form of landscaping around them. Then we get lower profile flats in the 1950s, and we've got this one will say here was started in the 50s, and then they decided to expand it, develop it, and in these flats we find that some of them are including lifts which will give access to the upper floors. So in 1950, Melville Richards went off. He went off to Harrow to be the engineer and surveyor there, and then he went on to become president of the Institute of Civil and Mechanical Engineers. And his place was taken by his deputy, George Albert Pentecost, who was to continue as the engineer and surveyor up until Hornsey was incorporated into Haringey. So just, I haven't got a photograph of him, but we get this continuation because Pentecost had been with Hornsey since 1939. So he joined Hornsey in 1935. He spent some time doing war service and then came back as the deputy engineer in 1946. So there's a continuity in terms of the design and development of these estates. 1953, sticking to Melville Richards' plan, the first flats on the Campsbourne estate were opened. We've got these 5 different schemes with a variety of accommodation, and then we get to 1 or 2 blocks which are noticeably different and more like outliers to the estate. They opened this block in 1954. It was called Charter Court because it was 50 years after the borough obtained its charter to be a municipal borough. It went from municipal borough estate in 1903. So they thought, well, let's name a block of flats in honour of that. But it's not a terribly exciting block, like some of the others. But we then come back to Campsbourne flats here, and another court here in Stroud Green, and they are looking at a little bit utilitarian in terms of their outside style and decoration. Probably not surprising, because there would have been a degree of thinking, well, we've got to get these flats up quickly. We've got to stick with fairly standard designs. We may vary the accommodation, but we're not going to pay too much attention to the appearance of them. But the same wasn't really the case in Campsbourne. This is Campsbourne in 1958-59, which after its first flats blocks were put up, it then moved to looking at a much more varied provision within the estate. Remember, this was a slum estate built in 1866, which had virtually no facilities, hardly any sewage, just a few cesspits, no water or anything. That was condemned in 1938, and they built a new model village. This is a village within Hornsey Village, and this is the heart of it, Boyton Close. And this it's difficult on a photograph to do justice to it, but on a photograph which doesn't project terribly well, it's even more difficult. But it's a mixture of flats, blocks of flats at the end, two-storey and three-storey buildings. The two-storey buildings are all houses. The three-storey building here are blocks of flats. It's on a cul-de-sac, which has been designed to have car parking spaces off the main carriageway, and this is taken really from one end of it, so you're looking down the whole Boyton Close, and I think you look at that and you think this was really imaginative design. It was landscape, there were lots of trees. The early photographs of how it opened in 1959 and 60, you can see there were lots of trees, and it is a very peaceful looking setting. The estate didn't maintain that reputation, and it's had to be renovated a lot in the last few years. So we're looking at basically this how it has been renovated in the beginning of the century. But when I first looked at this, I thought this is the sort of architectural attention to detail that would render Campsbourne estate as being a good architectural model. It was never submitted as an architectural model because it was built too late for any of those competitions. But it's my personal favourite. I think it looks rather wonderful. Anyway, the phases of Campsbourne Estate went on beyond 1965, but up until 1965 there were successive phases of developments of the flats, and you can get some idea of the change in the design of the flats as we're moving from these sorts of, if you like, almost house-style blocks of flats to a much more horizontal development, where you've got the balconies and all on these horizontal things with either shops or units underneath, and you get and you get these developments changing. This is the last block of flats that was built on Stroud Green estate. It's a house. It's a fairly sort of standard utilitarian type of construction. And here we've got, same year, we've got this really rather new style of flats being built on Campsbourne. And Campsbourne continues to develop, where we've got these similar flats and houses. No, not this one. I think it's the next one. Housing, which is built in much the same sort of style, along some of what remains of the original road layout. The layout of the road layout of the Campsbourne estate is, if you knew what the layout was before, you could say yes, it's the same, but it's been altered, and it's been a lot varied. So the main roads like Middleton Road, which went from right the way down the estate, is now broken up so that you don't have a through road. So it's been done in a way in which you have vehicular access to the estate, but you don't have any through traffic. So it makes the estate a much more livable place. And there are children's playgrounds and open spaces within the confines of that estate, which were designed to make it much more of a village atmosphere in its own right. So all of those blocks of flats survived, except for this one. This one was one block of flats built in 1936, and that was pulled down in about 2000, something like that, and it's been replaced by a not very attractive private block of flats. But you can see that this was this again was perhaps a fairly utilitarian attempt in the 1930s to provide working class housing, which actually, if you look at all the other flats they were building, you think it's a bit of a disappointment.
Where is that?
This is a place called Turnpike Lane, and it's no longer there, and I think what's been put up is even worse, but still. So by 1965, Hornsey had become a major provider of housing. A major providing of housing, not just for the working classes. It started off in 1897, building housing for the working classes under the Housing and Working Class Act, up until the Second World War. That was principally its concern. After the Second World War, it moved into a general housing provider, and it was providing accommodation on a social basis. Rents were based on household income, which was set between a maximum and a minimum level of 24 and £5 a week. So they set up this range. We would charge rents within this range. And the average costs, in 1964, the council tenants amounted to just under 10% of the total population of the borough, and rents were in the order of £1 to £2 a week for But they had this scheme here, which we can see. The maximum rent was only payable where the weekly income exceeded £24, and the minimum paid was where the income was less than £5 4 shillings a week. And the numbers of people who were in those two extremes was relatively few, but in between those two, it was very carefully controlled by the council. In 1953, the council did decide that they would introduce a very permissive scheme to enable tenants to buy their own flats if they wanted to. This is nothing like the right to buy. This was a permissive scheme. When a flat became empty, if the council didn't have any tenants who needed to be accommodated or wanted to be accommodated, then they would say to other tenants, if you want to buy a flat, you can. But they actually said to any residents, if you want to buy one of these flats, you can. But they were very careful about who they sold flats to. On the whole, they only sold them to tenants who wanted to buy into. They may have wanted to buy a bigger flat. They may have wanted, they may have wanted better accommodation, or they may have wanted to, their children had grown up or whatever. They may have wanted to move into a smaller flat. In practice, out of the, I can't remember how many it was, but the 30 or so flats that were sold under this scheme, they were nearly all sold. They were all sold to existing council tenants. So, how did this council go about paying for all of this? Up until the Second World War, the vast majority of their council housing was paid for by long-term government loans from the local government board, 60-year loans, which were then repaid at a favourable interest rate, and that was all funded by the rental income from the flats. And the rental income from the flats was quite closely controlled. There were a couple of exceptions where they did take government subsidies, but I won't go into that now. After the Second World War, they started to take subsidies, and I've tried to summarise on the screen the way in which the subsidies were payable. This is, I don't claim to be have made a very good job of summarising this because it's enormously complicated. There were so many caveats, but generally speaking, between 1947 and 56, they got just over £16 per dwelling, which was an annual subsidy, which for a Conservative local government was probably quite attractive, where we could get some money for it. But the Subsidies Act in 56 reduced the level of subsidies for general purposes to nothing, but for some slum clearance flats under 4 stories, they got £22 per dwelling. So the whole structure changed, right? But bearing in mind that there were in 56, they were still engaged in some slum clearance programme. If you try and look at the Treasurer's accounts and make sense of which schemes were getting subsidies and how much they were getting, I haven't been able to do that yet because I don't have enough understanding of. There were so many exceptions. Flats of different blocks on different sites, different numbers of flats had additional amounts of subsidy. Anyway, by 1961 there were radical changes by introducing 2 rates of subsidy for every new construction, namely £24 per dwelling or £8 per dwelling, payable against the resources test. So that was then how the council then had to put in a bid to say what they could afford and why they should get a particular subsidy. But all of this really goes, as far as I can make sense of, they did all of this council housing with no particular load on the rates. There were some occasions where, when they applied for a scheme, they were obliged to make a charge on the rates to pay for some of that scheme. And again, it's one of those complicated situations which needs a lot more research. And I did ask a question at the summer school about how was post-war council housing funded, and I got the question, well, we don't really know, but we have to actually go and start looking at all the records in the National Archives, and I did get some references, but I haven't done it. But the gist of it all was that Hornsey, having built all these things, developed a social policy of housing which controlled the rents, which actually didn't cost the local ratepayers any money. And believe you me, the local ratepayers were up in arms at any idea that they might find that they were, subsidising any public building, or they didn't like the idea of board schools, they didn't like the idea of council housing, they didn't like anything that the council was spending because they thought, it was going to be a load on the rates. But Hornsey took the view that we build on this, we won't put a load on the rates, and at the end of the loan periods we will have assets which accrue to the council. And we could, if we wanted to, this was their justification, we could, if we wanted to, realise some of those assets. And their permissive scheme that they started in 1953 was a tentative move to say, yes, we can perhaps realise some of those assets. But they weren't just about building their own housing and housing their own people. They also were very supportive of the Hornsey Housing Trust, which provided additional housing, and this was financial support under the Acquisition of Small Dwellings scheme, which operated and is not always clearly recorded in the Treasurer's accounts. But basically, there was a housing trust that was set up by Margaret Hill in 1933 to provide housing for old age pensioners and families who were in some need. It still exists as a separate housing trust and provides an awful lot of social housing in and around Haringey. But by 1954, Hornsey had been making allowances to that housing trust of over £1 million. So they clearly had a policy in terms of investment in housing, and investment in social housing, and they understood the benefits that had. In amongst all the housing on the Campsbourne estate, there were 2 or 3 blocks specifically devoted to people with disabilities or disabilities of any sort. So 2 blocks of sheltered housing, which had been developed by the council, and then Hornsey Housing Trust was doing much the same. So that brings me to the end of the story, really. Hornsey, proud of its local housing building and policies, disappeared in 1965. Haringey took over that mantle, but of course it was a lot more difficult because Tottenham and Wood Green both had housing stock in council housing, which was operated under different schemes, and so Haringey had to start making compromises to make sure that they all aligned. But of course they were hit by the Right to Buy Act in 1980, which completely undermined their ability to maintain this policy. And social housing then became the responsibility of non-for-profit housing outside of local authorities, and we get to the situation we've got today, which many people regard as a housing crisis, but I don't think it's a crisis, because a crisis is something that happens suddenly and then disappears again. We have a housing problem. So I think that's where I would end it.
Thank you.